The wedding photographer showed me a picture 3 days after my wedding. The moment I saw it, I finally understood why everything had gone wrong. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary photograph. Guests were smiling. The ballroom lights glowed warmly against the cream-colored walls. Fresh white roses decorated every table exactly the way I had planned. It looked like the perfect wedding, the kind people post online and remember fondly for years. But hidden near the edge of the frame was a detail that changed everything. A detail that destroyed the carefully crafted image my mother-in-law had spent decades building. My name is Claire Donovan, and until my wedding day, I truly believed that if I treated people with kindness, they would eventually do the same in return. Looking back now, I realize how naive that sounds. 3 days before the wedding, I was still convinced that Margaret Hayes and I were finally finding common ground. She had never openly welcomed me into the family, but after 4 years with her son Nathan, I thought the worst was behind us. We had survived awkward holidays, uncomfortable family dinners, and countless passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. I thought we had reached a place of mutual respect. I was wrong. The morning of my wedding began before sunrise. I remember opening my eyes and staring at the ceiling of my hotel suite while my heart raced with excitement. After nearly a year of planning, the day had finally arrived. Outside my window, the city was just beginning to wake up. The streets below were quiet. The sky carried soft shades of pink and gold. Everything felt calm, hopeful, perfect. My bridesmaids arrived shortly after 7 o'clock carrying coffee, pastries, and enough energy to fill the entire suite. Laughter echoed through the room as makeup artists unpacked brushes and hairstylists prepared their stations. For a while, I allowed myself to relax. I looked around at the people I loved and felt grateful. Then my phone buzzed. It was Margaret. Her message was simple: "Call me immediately." I remember staring at those words. Even on my wedding day, she had a way of making every request feel like a command. I stepped into the hallway and called her. Her voice sounded unusually sweet. That should have been my first warning. She asked whether I was sure about the seating arrangements. She wondered if Nathan was really comfortable with several decisions we had made. She casually mentioned that some family members had concerns about the ceremony. By the time the conversation ended, the excitement I had felt earlier had begun to fade. A small seed of doubt had taken its place. When I returned to the suite, I forced a smile and told everyone everything was fine. I didn't want drama. I didn't want conflict. I just wanted to marry the man I loved. As the morning continued, strange things started happening. My bouquet arrived nearly an hour late. One of the transportation reservations suddenly disappeared from the schedule. A vendor called asking about changes I had never requested. Each problem seemed small by itself. Annoying, but manageable. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time a problem appeared, Margaret somehow already knew about it. Every time confusion spread, she was nearby offering advice with that calm, reassuring smile. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention. But on your wedding day, you want to believe the best about people. You want to focus on love instead of suspicion. So I ignored the warning signs. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. I told myself stress was making me imagine things. I told myself everything would be fine once I saw Nathan standing at the altar. What I didn't know was that while I was trying to protect the happiness of that day, Margaret was quietly setting something else in motion. And before the night was over, she would make a mistake she never expected anyone to notice. The ceremony itself was beautiful, at least on the surface. By late afternoon, the ballroom overlooking the river was filled with family, friends, and the soft sound of a string quartet. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow across the room. When I finally stepped through the doors and saw Nathan waiting for me at the altar, everything else seemed to disappear. For a few precious moments, there was only him. The stress of the morning faded. The strange phone call, the scheduling problems, the lingering uneasiness. None of it mattered while I was walking toward the man I loved. Nathan smiled the way he always did when he was genuinely happy. It was the smile that had carried me through difficult days and long conversations about our future. Standing there beside him, I felt certain that we were making the right decision. The ceremony went smoothly. Our vows were sincere. Several guests wiped away tears. Even Margaret appeared composed and supportive. Anyone watching would have assumed she was thrilled to welcome me into the family. She sat in the front row with perfect posture, smiling at exactly the right moments. She looked like the picture of a proud mother. That image fooled almost everyone. After the ceremony, guests moved into the reception area while the photographer gathered us for formal portraits. The atmosphere was cheerful and relaxed. People laughed, hugged, and congratulated us. Yet as the evening unfolded, I began noticing small things that bothered me. Margaret seemed to insert herself into nearly every conversation. If someone complimented the wedding, she found a way to mention how much advice she had given. If someone praised the decorations, she hinted that she had influenced the final choices. It was subtle enough that most people would not think twice about it. But I noticed. More importantly, I noticed how often she redirected attention back to herself. At one point, a family friend told me I looked beautiful. Before I could even thank her, Margaret stepped between us and launched into a story about Nathan as a child. The conversation instantly shifted away from me. Similar moments happened throughout the evening. Alone, each incident seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. During dinner, I watched Margaret carefully. She moved from table to table with effortless confidence. Guests gravitated toward her. She laughed easily. She accepted compliments graciously. She played her role flawlessly. Yet every now and then, I caught a different expression crossing her face when she thought nobody was paying attention. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by another polished smile. But it was there, cold, calculating, measuring. As dessert was served, I stepped outside onto the terrace for a few minutes of fresh air. The sun was beginning to set beyond the river, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. I should have felt completely happy. Instead, a strange sense of tension lingered in the back of my mind. I could not explain it. Nothing openly terrible had happened. The reception was successful. The guests seemed to be enjoying themselves. Nathan was having the time of his life. And yet I felt as though something important was happening just outside my field of vision. Something I was not supposed to notice. Inside the ballroom, music drifted through the open doors. Laughter followed. I took a deep breath and reminded myself to enjoy the evening. What I did not know was that somewhere inside that crowded room, a camera had already captured the moment that would eventually reveal everything Margaret had worked so hard to hide. The reception continued well into the evening, and from the outside it looked exactly like the celebration I had always imagined. The dance floor stayed busy. Guests filled the room with conversation and laughter. Servers moved between tables carrying slices of wedding cake and fresh coffee. Everywhere I looked, people seemed happy. Nathan certainly was. He spent most of the evening greeting relatives, sharing stories with old friends, and thanking everyone for coming. Watching him smile should have put me at ease. Instead, the uneasy feeling I had carried all day refused to disappear. The more I observed Margaret, the stronger that feeling became. She never raised her voice. She never openly criticized me. In fact, anyone watching her would have described her as charming. That was what made her so effective. She understood that the most damaging comments were often delivered with a pleasant smile. At one table, I overheard her telling guests how stressful wedding planning had been. She laughed softly and said that young brides sometimes became overwhelmed by details. Several people nodded sympathetically. The comment sounded harmless. Yet, somehow the conversation shifted toward my supposed mistakes rather than the success of the event. Later, I watched her speaking with one of Nathan's elderly relatives. As I approached, the woman gave me an odd look before quickly forcing a smile. The interaction lasted only a second, but it stayed with me. It was not the first strange reaction I had received that evening. A few guests seemed distant. Others appeared uncomfortable when speaking to me. I could not understand why. I had barely had time to talk with most of them all day. Around 9 o'clock, I finally sat down for a moment beside my bridesmaid Emma. She studied my face carefully before asking whether I was all right. I told her I was simply tired. That answer did not seem to convince her. After a brief hesitation, she admitted that she had overheard Margaret sharing several stories about me throughout the evening. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously cruel, just enough carefully selected details to create an unflattering picture. Emma said the stories made me sound controlling, demanding, and difficult to please. I stared at her in disbelief. Those descriptions felt completely disconnected from reality. Yet suddenly the strange looks from guests began to make sense. Someone had been shaping their opinions all night. Someone had been quietly rewriting the narrative of my own wedding. I glanced across the ballroom and saw Margaret standing near the bar. She was laughing with a group of guests. Her posture was relaxed. Her expression was warm. She looked completely innocent. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Her smile never changed. Neither did mine. But something shifted inside me. For the first time, I stopped assuming that the problems surrounding the wedding were random coincidences. The missing reservations, the confusing vendor calls, the subtle comments, the uncomfortable reactions from guests. The pieces were beginning to connect. I simply did not have proof yet. As the evening drew closer to its end, photographers continued moving through the room, capturing candid moments. Cameras flashed. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked together during final toasts. Nobody paid much attention to the photographers anymore. They had become part of the background. And somewhere among hundreds of ordinary images being captured that night, a single photograph was preserving a truth that Margaret never realized would eventually come back to haunt her. The wedding ended just after midnight. By the time Nathan and I returned to our hotel suite, exhaustion had finally begun to replace the adrenaline that had carried us through the day. He fell asleep almost immediately. I should have done the same. Instead, I sat by the window looking out at the city lights below. The room was quiet. For the first time all day, there were no guests to greet, no schedules to follow, and no smiles to maintain. Alone with my thoughts, I replayed the evening in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something had been wrong. Not one dramatic event, not one obvious confrontation, just 100 small moments that all seemed to point in the same direction. Over the next 2 days, Nathan and I focused on settling into married life. We opened gifts, responded to messages, and thanked relatives who had traveled long distances to attend the wedding. Most conversations were pleasant. Some, however, felt strange. A few guests made comments that caught me off guard. One person jokingly mentioned how demanding wedding planning must have been for me. Another said they were surprised Nathan had managed to survive the process. Both laughed as if repeating stories they had heard from someone else. I smiled politely, but inside I felt unsettled. Those descriptions did not sound like me. They sounded like a version of me someone had carefully created. On the third afternoon after the wedding, I received a message from Lucas Carter, our photographer. He wanted to stop by with a preview gallery and discuss the final editing schedule. Nothing unusual about that. Professional photographers often shared early images before delivering the complete collection. When he arrived, Nathan was running errands, so it was just the two of us reviewing photographs at the dining table. At first, the images were exactly what I expected. The ceremony, the vows, family portraits, the first dance. Each photograph captured a memory I wanted to preserve forever. Lucas clearly had a gift for finding genuine moments. As we continued scrolling, he paused unexpectedly. His expression changed. It was subtle, but noticeable. He leaned closer to the screen and frowned. Then he clicked backward through several images before stopping on one particular frame. For several seconds, he said nothing. I asked whether something was wrong. Lucas hesitated before turning the laptop toward me. The image looked ordinary at first. Guests filled the background. The reception was in full swing. Music had been playing when the picture was taken. People were smiling and talking. Yet near one edge of the frame stood Margaret. She believed she was outside the focus of the photograph. She was not looking toward the camera. She was looking toward a small group of guests gathered near one of the tables. What caught my attention was not where she stood. It was what she was doing. The image showed her speaking quietly while gesturing toward me across the room. The expressions on the faces around her told the rest of the story. Confusion, concern, judgment. In a single frozen moment, the photograph captured something Margaret had spent years hiding behind polite smiles and perfect manners. For the first time, I was not looking at a misunderstanding or a coincidence. I was looking at evidence. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. Lucas remained silent, allowing me to absorb what I was seeing. The photograph was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no obvious scene. That was precisely what made it so powerful. It captured a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Margaret was standing with 3 guests from Nathan's side of the family. One of them was his Aunt Linda. Another was a longtime family friend named Carol. The third was someone I barely knew. All 3 were focused entirely on Margaret. Their expressions told a story words could not fully explain. They looked uncomfortable, concerned, almost sympathetic, and every one of them was looking directly toward me. Lucas zoomed in slightly. The image became even clearer. Margaret's hand was extended toward me while she spoke. Her face carried none of the warmth she displayed whenever she knew people were watching. The pleasant smile was gone. In its place was an expression I recognized immediately. I had seen glimpses of it before, at holiday dinners, during family gatherings, in those brief moments when she thought nobody was paying attention. Looking at the photograph felt like finding the missing piece of a puzzle that had been sitting unfinished for years. Suddenly, countless memories resurfaced. The engagement dinner where several relatives seemed oddly distant toward me. The bridal shower where a guest asked whether I was really as controlling as people claimed. The uncomfortable silences that followed certain conversations. At the time, I had brushed each incident aside. I assumed misunderstandings happened in every family. Now I was beginning to see a pattern. Lucas continued reviewing the gallery. As he moved through the photographs, more details emerged. In another image, Margaret stood near a different group of guests. Again, she appeared to be discussing me. Again, people were looking in my direction. In a third photograph, she was speaking with two cousins while gesturing toward the head table where Nathan and I were seated. None of the pictures proved exactly what she had said. They did not need to. Together, they painted a remarkably consistent picture. The wedding that I thought had been filled with random tension suddenly made much more sense. After Lucas left, I sat alone for nearly an hour reviewing the images again. The longer I looked, the calmer I became. Surprisingly, I was not angry. I was tired. Tired of questioning my instincts. Tired of explaining away behavior that never felt right. Tired of convincing myself that every uncomfortable moment was my fault. When Nathan returned home, I showed him the photographs. At first, he did not understand why they mattered. He saw only ordinary wedding pictures. Then I pointed out the repeated pattern. The same groups, the same conversations, the same expressions. Gradually, his confidence faded. He became quiet, very quiet. That worried me more than any argument could have. Nathan had spent his entire life believing his mother was incapable of manipulation. Seeing even a small crack in that belief was not easy for him. He asked to review the gallery by himself. I gave him space. Nearly 30 minutes later, he finally looked up from the screen. His expression was troubled, not because the photographs showed something shocking, but because they confirmed something he had been trying not to see for years. And for the first time since our wedding day, Nathan began asking questions about his mother that he had never been willing to ask before. The following week felt different. Nothing had been openly resolved, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. Nathan did not confront his mother immediately. That was not his nature. Instead, he started paying attention, really paying attention. For years, he had dismissed small concerns because each one seemed insignificant on its own. Now he was looking at them together. One evening, while sorting through wedding cards and gifts, he mentioned something that happened months before our engagement. His mother had warned him that I might eventually try to distance him from his family. At the time, he thought she was simply being protective. Then he remembered similar comments made before family vacations, holiday gatherings, and birthdays. Each remark had been subtle. None sounded alarming by themselves. Yet they all pointed in the same direction. Little by little, she had been planting doubts. As Nathan reflected on those conversations, more memories surfaced. I listened quietly. This was not a moment for me to prove I had been right. It was a moment for him to see things clearly on his own. Over the next several days, he spoke with relatives who attended the wedding. The conversations were revealing. Aunt Linda admitted that Margaret had spent much of the reception discussing concerns about me. Carol shared a similar account. Another guest recalled hearing that I was difficult to work with during wedding planning. None of them understood why those stories were being shared during a celebration that was supposed to bring two families together. The most surprising part was that several people assumed Nathan already knew. They believed his mother was simply repeating family concerns that had been discussed openly. When they realized he had never heard any of it, the conversations became uncomfortable. Their reactions told him more than their words did. One afternoon, Nathan sat quietly at the kitchen table reviewing old messages on his phone. I watched his expression change as he scrolled through years of conversations. Certain patterns became impossible to ignore. Whenever an important event approached, his mother seemed to create some form of conflict. A birthday dinner, a graduation celebration, a holiday gathering. There was always a problem, always a misunderstanding, always a reason for attention to shift back toward her. The realization was painful for him. Not because he suddenly stopped loving his mother, but because he could no longer ignore behavior he had spent years explaining away. Then another unexpected piece of information arrived. Sophie Reed, our wedding planner, called to check on us. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that someone had contacted multiple vendors before the wedding asking detailed questions about scheduling changes. Sophie assumed the requests came from a close family member acting on our behalf. When she reviewed her records, she discovered those inquiries originated from Margaret. Hearing that confirmation felt strangely calming. Another mystery solved. Another missing piece placed where it belonged. None of these discoveries were dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no emotional scenes, just facts. Quiet facts accumulating one after another. And with every new detail, the image Margaret had carefully maintained for so many years became harder to defend. The woman everyone believed they knew was slowly being replaced by the truth. Not through rumors, not through accusations, but through her own actions finally being seen for what they were. By the end of the second week, the truth was no longer something Nathan and I discussed privately. It had started spreading naturally through conversations among family members. Nobody was organizing a campaign against Margaret. Nobody was trying to embarrass her. People were simply comparing experiences. Once they started doing that, similarities appeared everywhere. Aunt Linda called one evening and shared a story from years earlier. She described how Margaret had quietly undermined a cousin's engagement because she disliked the woman he planned to marry. Another relative remembered being told misleading information before a family gathering, only to discover later that the story was completely inaccurate. A longtime family friend admitted she had often left conversations with Margaret feeling confused about people she barely knew. None of these stories sounded dramatic on their own. What mattered was the pattern. For decades, Margaret had maintained control by making sure everyone only saw a small piece of the picture. Nobody realized how many similar experiences existed until they began talking to one another. The wedding photographs had not created the problem. They had simply exposed it. One Saturday afternoon, Nathan received a message from his cousin Michael. They had always been close, and Michael rarely involved himself in family disputes. That was why his message carried so much weight. He explained that after seeing some of the photographs and hearing concerns from several relatives, he had started reflecting on past family events. The more he thought about them, the more he realized how often conflict seemed to originate from the same source. Nathan sat quietly after reading the message. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed. There is a difference. Anger can fade quickly. Disappointment settles much deeper. Later that evening, he told me something I will never forget. He said that for most of his life, he had believed family loyalty meant refusing to question people you loved. Now he understood that real loyalty sometimes required honesty. Protecting harmful behavior was not kindness. Ignoring reality was not respect. Those words marked a turning point. Around the same time, several wedding guests reached out to me directly. Some apologized for believing negative assumptions about me. Others admitted they had formed opinions based on conversations they now viewed differently. Their messages were thoughtful and sincere. Reading them felt strange. I had spent years wondering whether I was imagining the tension. Now people were confirming what I had sensed all along. The most surprising development came from Carol, one of the guests who appeared in the photograph with Margaret. She asked if we could meet for coffee. During our conversation, she explained that Margaret had spent a large portion of the reception portraying me as controlling and manipulative. At the time, Carol accepted those comments because she trusted the source. After seeing the photographs and hearing similar accounts from others, she began questioning everything. She looked genuinely uncomfortable as she spoke. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said the photograph captured the first honest expression she had ever seen on Margaret's face. By then, the image Margaret had spent years building was beginning to crumble under the weight of simple facts. No dramatic confrontation had taken place. No public argument had occurred. People were just seeing the same person more clearly than before. And once that process began, it became impossible to reverse. About a month after the wedding, the situation reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken. By then, too many conversations had taken place. Too many people had compared experiences. Too many questions had surfaced. The version of events Margaret had controlled for years was beginning to slip away from her. The turning point came during a family gathering at Nathan's uncle's house. It was supposed to be a casual Sunday lunch. Nothing formal. just relatives sharing a meal and catching up. Under normal circumstances, Margaret would have been at the center of every conversation. People would have listened to her stories, laughed at her jokes, and accepted her version of events without hesitation. This time felt different from the moment we arrived. The atmosphere was polite but cautious. Relatives still greeted Margaret warmly, yet there was a noticeable distance that had not existed before. People seemed more observant, more thoughtful. Instead of immediately accepting everything she said, they listened. Carefully, they asked questions. They compared information. For someone who had spent years controlling the narrative, that subtle shift was significant. Throughout lunch, Margaret attempted to steer conversations the way she always had. She mentioned the wedding several times. She described how stressful the planning process had supposedly been. She made a few familiar comments about how difficult certain situations had become for her. Under normal circumstances, those remarks would have generated sympathy. This time they produced silence. Not hostile silence, thoughtful silence. Several relatives exchanged brief glances. Others simply changed the subject. I watched Margaret notice the difference. At first she seemed confused, then frustrated. Eventually she began trying harder. The stories became slightly more dramatic. The details became more exaggerated. Unfortunately for her, many of the people sitting around the table now possessed information she did not realize they had. Aunt Linda gently corrected one version of events. Carol questioned another. Michael mentioned facts that contradicted a story Margaret had just told. None of them were aggressive. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody attacked her. They simply spoke honestly. For perhaps the first time in years, Margaret found herself unable to control the conversation. The most revealing moment came when someone casually referenced the wedding photographs. The room grew noticeably quieter. Margaret immediately dismissed the images as misunderstandings. Then she claimed people were overreacting. Then she insisted that everyone was unfairly judging her intentions. The explanations changed repeatedly within the span of a few minutes. As she continued speaking, something remarkable happened. People stopped focusing on the photographs themselves. Instead, they started paying attention to her reactions. The defensiveness, the contradictions, the refusal to acknowledge even the possibility that she had contributed to the situation. Every attempt to protect her image seemed to weaken it further. Nathan remained calm throughout the entire conversation. He never accused his mother of anything. He simply listened. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and respectful. He said that trust could only exist when people were honest with one another. He said that avoiding difficult truths had helped nobody. Then he quietly explained how hurtful it had been to discover the extent of the gossip surrounding our wedding. The disappointment in his voice affected the room more than any argument could have. By the time lunch ended, nobody needed additional proof. The image Margaret had carefully maintained for so many years was collapsing under the weight of her own choices. And the most painful part for her was that nobody had destroyed it. They had simply stopped pretending not to see what was already there. 6 months later, my life looked very different from the one I imagined on my wedding day. Not because of the problems that had surfaced, but because of how we chose to respond to them. Nathan and I stopped focusing on what his mother had done and started focusing on the life we wanted to build together. We settled into our routines, hosted dinners with friends, explored new places on weekends, and created traditions that belonged to us. For the first time since our engagement, I felt completely at peace. The tension that had followed me through family gatherings for years slowly disappeared. I no longer felt responsible for managing someone else's opinions. I no longer spent hours analyzing uncomfortable conversations or wondering whether I had done something wrong. The truth had finally removed that burden. Margaret remained part of the family, but her position within it had changed. People were still polite. They still treated her with respect. What disappeared was the unquestioning trust she had once relied upon. Family members listened more carefully. They verified information before accepting it. They formed their own conclusions instead of borrowing hers. The change was subtle but permanent. For someone who had spent years shaping narratives, losing that influence was perhaps the greatest consequence of all. Occasionally, I would hear updates through relatives. Margaret often complained that people had become distant. She could not understand why relationships felt different. From her perspective, everyone else had changed. From mine, they had simply become more aware. Awareness has a way of transforming relationships. Once people see a pattern clearly, They cannot pretend they never noticed it. One evening, nearly 7 months after the wedding, Nathan and I were looking through our completed wedding album. Lucas had done remarkable work. Every page captured a moment from one of the most important days of our lives. As we turned the pages, we laughed at memories, shared stories, and pointed out details we had forgotten. Then we reached the photograph. The image that had started everything. I studied it quietly for several seconds. It looked exactly the same as it had months earlier. Yet my feelings about it had changed completely. When I first saw that picture, I viewed it as evidence. Proof that something was wrong. Proof that my instincts had been correct. Now I saw something else. I saw a turning point. A moment when reality finally became impossible to ignore. Nathan looked at the image and smiled faintly. Then he closed the album. Neither of us felt the need to discuss it further. We already understood what it represented. The photograph had never destroyed anyone. It had simply revealed the truth. What happened afterward was the result of choices people made when they finally saw that truth clearly. Looking back now, I think the most valuable lesson came from something my grandmother used to say. She believed that character eventually reveals itself, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. At the time, I thought she was speaking about dramatic situations. Instead, she was talking about ordinary moments, conversations, decisions, small actions repeated over time. Those are the things that reveal who we really are. I never got revenge. I never needed revenge. The people who mattered saw the truth for themselves. Nathan and I built a happy life together. And the image that changed everything remained exactly what it had always been from the beginning. One honest photograph in a room full of carefully constructed appearances.